В этом фильме я расскажу об идее, которая оказала огромное влияние на мир.
This is an extraordinary story involving some of the giants of history and some of the most cataclysmic events. All of them transformed by, inspired by, just one beautiful and dangerous idea. The idea sprang from one man's dream of a perfectly equal society. Once unleashed, though, it took on a life of its own, inflaming half the planet, terrifying the other. It would shake the world.
Не только на мою страну, но и на весь мир.
"74 years ago, I was born into a passionate communist family, and I remained a communist most of my life. But as leader of the Soviet Union, I decided freedom must come before communism. I introduced reforms which would lead in time to the defining moment of my career. My visit to East Berlin in 1989.
Мы стоим все, кто приехал.
During an official rally, I stood on the rostrum watching the crowd. They were young and full of joy. And they chanted, "Gorbachev, stay here with us for a month. Reform, reform." One of the old leaders turned to me and asked, "Do you understand German?"
Михаил Сергеевич, вы по-немецки понимаете? Я говорю, ну для того, чтобы лозунги прочитать.
I said, "I understand enough to read the slogans."
Но это же конец.
He said,
Я говорю, да.
"But this is the end."
Ну, конец режиму и начало другому.
And I said, "Yes,
Это на трибуне.
it's the end of the communist
У нас
regime."
разговор состоялся.
So why did I do what I did? What made me lose my faith in communism? To understand my life and my work, you have to understand the idea of communism itself, where it came from, and what went wrong with this great idea. In a graveyard in London lie the remains of the man who created communism, Karl Marx. Marx was horrified by the exploitation and poverty he saw around him under capitalism. And in 1848, he proposed a utopian vision of an alternative type of society.
Я не знаю более успешного документа.
The Communist Manifesto was an earth-shattering document.
Это потрясающий вообще документ.
Later, in exile in England, he said he'd discovered the means to make his vision come true. Until Marx, most philosophers had thought poverty was accidental. But Marx said poverty was a deliberate creation of the capitalist system. And now, he suggested a solution. Eventually, Marx said, workers would be made so poor they would have nothing to lose. They would rise up and seize control. And a new kind of society would result. A communist society in which everything would be owned communally. It was a beautiful idea. The reality of communism was to be very different. Marx's revolutionary idea spread across Europe, inspiring one revolt after another. But they were all unsuccessful until it reached Russia. Few communists thought Russia was ready for Marx's idea. It was a backward peasant country, ruled by the Tsar, an all-powerful emperor who was considered semi-divine. His was a ruthless regime, and it seemed utterly secure. But two things were to change all that. One was the First World War. The war bankrupted Russia. Thousands starved. Workers and even soldiers joined strikes. The Tsar's regime edged towards collapse. And it was now that an extraordinary man made a journey home to Russia. He set out secretly by train from exile. He was in disguise. The Tsar's spies were everywhere. But somehow, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin managed to make it back to the capital, ready to change the world. Lenin took from Marx the uncompromising belief that communism was inevitable, so there could be no legitimate opposition. In Moscow, he led a small revolutionary clique of communists, the Bolsheviks. Together, they plotted to impose communism on the people. They seized the opportunity when an uprising of peasants turned into an explosive revolution. In a series of brilliant maneuvers, the Bolsheviks took control of workers' organizations and soon the entire nation. On October the 25th, 1917, Lenin proclaimed the first communist state in history.
Дед мой, первых дней.
From the very first days of the revolution, my grandfather was involved in setting up this new regime. He'd returned from the trenches of the First World War to find his family close to starvation. Both food and land were in the hands of oppressive landlords. But after the revolution, the communists gave him land and food seized from the rich.
Но пришла советская власть и дала нам землю.
My grandfather always used to say that the Soviet regime saved our family from starvation.
Слова деда остались во мне и сейчас. Даже когда арестовали.
My grandfather joined the Communist Party. Then banded together with other farmers and drew up bold plans that would make all our lives better in the future. All across Russia, millions of others did the same. And there was a wave of optimism. For almost a decade, despite civil war and famine, Lenin battled to turn the idea of communism into a reality. But even he began to realize that imposing communism would never work. You had to allow people to better themselves and express themselves. He didn't, though, get a chance to implement his new vision. In 1924, Lenin died. Communist Russia was barely 7 years old. Now, with no clear successor to Lenin, a battle broke out for the soul of the country. The man who succeeded Lenin was Joseph Vissarionovich Dugashvili, but he's better known by his alias, Stalin, the man of steel. Stalin had his own vision of communism. It was a brutal, narrow one. Marx had said communism would be built by an industrial workforce. So now Stalin set about forcing millions of peasants into giant factories, whatever the cost. People were uprooted. Millions died in famines, all sacrificed to the creation of an industrial superpower. And all this controlled in minute detail from the center in Moscow by him.
Stalin диктаторский.
Stalin was a more extreme dictator than Lenin. He constructed a totalitarian system. He ruled by repression. He ruled by fear. This was Stalin's regime.
Это все режим Сталина.
To impose his will, Stalin built up a cult around his personality. Naturally, none of this had been in Marx.
У нас это было коммунистическое.
What we had in real life was not what was proclaimed in the Communist Manifesto. Absolutely not.
Это, конечно, абсолютно не то, что...
Anything other than total obedience was not tolerated. My grandfather was a devoted communist. But during a famine, he dared to keep back a little grain he'd grown for our own private use. The secret police arrested him. I was 9 when my grandfather came back, and he told us about the torture he was subjected to. All of us listened to his story. We all had tears in our eyes. But he never told that story again. He never repeated it. Stalin, he'd always say. It wasn't Stalin's fault.
И самое главное, он говорил, Сталин не виноват.
He was only one of millions who suffered a similar fate, or worse. Only recently has Russia built monuments to the millions who suffered and died in Stalin's labor camps.
На расстрельных списках
I don't know whether my grandfather can hear me, but now I can tell him that I personally saw Stalin's signature on the lists of people intended for imprisonment and execution.
Или их расстреливали.
By the end of the 1930s, communism had become a living nightmare. We thought it couldn't get worse. But it did. For the Nazis, communism was a bitter ideological rival. Once Hitler had conquered most of Europe, he turned his attention to what he called the Bolshevik menace. In 1941, he sent 3 million troops to try to crush the Soviet Union. I saw the war with my own eyes. The Nazis attacked us mercilessly. The Red Army struggled to even slow the advance. I lived in Nazi-occupied territory for over 5 months. The Nazis seemed unstoppable. Millions of ordinary Russians were rounded up. Any communists who fell into their hands were immediately executed. In my village is a monument to those who died in the war. Among them are 5 Gorbachevs.
Среди них 5 человек Горбачевы.
It looked as if the Soviet Union would be defeated. But then, the Red Army fought back. Hitler had claimed that communism would so weaken the willpower of Russians, they'd quickly surrender. In fact, the opposite happened. Now the central control of the party began to work in the country's favor. Huge resources could be marshaled. Absolute discipline maintained. United by its belief in communism, the Red Army became an incredible fighting machine, which stopped the Nazis in their tracks and then pushed them back inexorably. And as the Nazis fell back, the Red Army followed them all the way, even back to their lair, Berlin. It was an astonishing turnaround that seemed nothing short of a miracle. For me and many others, it seemed communism had saved the world. And so it seemed completely natural to us when communist regimes sprang up across the world. From Berlin to Peking, leaders professed themselves communist. It got even better when Stalin died, and our new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, set out a modern vision of communism. Communism seemed the way of the future. The Soviet Union matched and then surpassed the West in technology, art, sport, and the most emblematic of all, space. We were the first in space with our satellite, Sputnik. And the first man in space was Gagarin, a proud communist. Few in Russia doubted that communism was on the march. Certainly not me. In the 50s, I went to university. I was the son of a peasant and the first person in my family ever to do this. As far as I was concerned, the mighty Moscow State University was the pinnacle of the greatest education system the world had ever seen. And it was communism which had given me this opportunity. It was while I was here, I met the person who would shape my life. Raisa Maximovna. It was Raisa who encouraged me to take my first steps into politics. Although I never asked for promotion, I moved up the career ladder very quickly. I moved up through the regional party, and then up through the national party in quick succession. In time, I would reach the very height of power in the world's biggest communist state. But only then would I realize that the communist system was fatally flawed. In the 1840s, Karl Marx had an intoxicating dream of a perfect communist society. In little over a century, his dream seemed on the brink of being realized. The Soviet Union was a communist superpower. And our leader, Nikita Khrushchev, even brought together reformers who had a fresh vision of Marx. Their dream was to combine communism with democracy and give it a human face. But then something terrible happened. Old allies of Stalin fought back. They ousted Khrushchev from power and brought back a hard-line communist regime. Leonid Brezhnev stopped the experiment in its tracks. Freedom of expression was curtailed, and the old dead hand of central planning by the Communist Party was brought back. Everything was controlled, from the nursery school to the last days of a person's life. The regime retreated again into Stalinist paranoia. They insisted we had to match the West's arms spending. The result was economic stagnation and decline. This was the situation when I arrived in Moscow in November 1978. My career in politics had been going from strength to strength, and now I faced the ultimate promotion. To the Politburo itself, the committee which ruled the entire Soviet Union and the lives of its 200 million citizens. The Politburo was like the Everest of power. I told one of the other members I wasn't sure whether I'd be able to cope. And he said, "It doesn't matter if you can cope or not, who cares? The only thing that matters is that Leonid Brezhnev trusts you." And I sensed that that was the crucial phrase. The next day, Brezhnev welcomed me to the Politburo. When I started work in the Politburo, I hoped I could really do something to make a difference for others. But the system held everyone rigidly in place, so I managed to achieve very little. Outwardly, life went on as normal, but the people could see for themselves that the country was falling behind. Their criticism might have invigorated things, but they weren't allowed to criticize. Instead, all the political debates were in the kitchens of Russian apartments. It stemmed from the belief that the centralized system developed by Lenin and Stalin was the only right way to run communism. We were so constrained because for years we'd steered a Stalinist course, and the whole world looked at us and saw us as an enemy. The Soviet Union spent $10 trillion on the arms race. What else could we have done with that money? The whole infrastructure of the country was grinding to a halt. How could we say communism was the best economic system when people had to wait for hours to buy the bare necessities, and every decision was taken by the Central Committee? It was a real disgrace when the leadership even had to discuss problems with ladies' underwear. It was a laugh, but it was a fact. In 1985, President Chernenko, another old leader, died. Now, finally, this was my moment. I was put forward as a candidate to be the Soviet leader. At 3 in the morning, I came home. My wife Raisa was waiting up for me. It was then I said to her, "Tomorrow I may be appointed president." Raisa was wary of me taking such a high post, but I felt I couldn't say no. I couldn't avoid taking responsibility, because then power would be given to another old leader. Everyone wanted a dramatic shift in politics. I was voted in unanimously. I knew I had an enormous task ahead. The first step was obvious. Take the money we spent on arms and use it to rebuild the country. But if I was to cut our weapons, I had to be sure America would do the same.
I don't know how much more flexible we can be, but we're...
President Ronald Reagan had attacked communism for its lack of freedom. He saw us as the enemy, calling us an evil empire. When we met, no one expected a meeting of minds. I was asked my opinion of Reagan. I said he's a real dinosaur. And Newsweek asked Reagan the same question. He said, he's a hardliner. He's a communist with a hard head. But soon the mood changed. Our talks were frank, extremely frank. I told Reagan I didn't want, didn't need so many nuclear bombs. I convinced Ronald Reagan that I was not his enemy. He should not fear the Soviet Union.
На второй день мы с ним вышли и перед всем миром
Eventually,
заявили,
we were able to make a joint statement to the whole world.
мы считаем,
We said that we believed that nuclear war was unacceptable because there could be no winners. This was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Soon afterwards, the first weapons of mass destruction were being destroyed.
положили начало уничтожению.
We started the process of nuclear arms destruction.
Колоссальный.
If that had been the only thing our reforms achieved, we'd have deserved a monument for that alone. Then I turned to a challenge which seemed every bit as difficult: the reform of the Soviet Union. When I started as leader, I still hoped to reinvigorate communism. If I could just release the energy and creativity of millions of our citizens, we could combine freedom and communism for the first time. I realized we needed a restructuring of the whole Soviet monolith. The word I used is now famous: perestroika.
Освобождать страну от всех занавесов,
We had to liberate the country from all its walls, all its fences, all the iron curtains. The obvious solution to me was to hold elections.
Страна впервые за 1000 лет выбирала открыто и
These were the
свободно,
first
и без
free
фальсификаций.
elections in the 1000-year history of Russia.
Без фальсификаций.
It was a culture shock at first, but the people soon behaved as if they'd voted all their lives. And now Russia was experimenting with democracy. This, though, wasn't going unnoticed across Eastern Europe. Half of Europe was run by brutal tyrannies, which, because they were communist in name, had the support of the Soviet Union. I felt this had to change, and so did the people. As millions took to the streets, the regimes tried to dig in, as they had so many times before. But this time, there was one big difference. When I visited East Berlin in 1989, my sympathies were obviously with the protesters. So after my visit, the protests just kept getting bigger. At first, many feared that we would send troops in, just as Stalin had, to crush rebellions. But I made it clear I would never countenance this. So the protests kept growing. Till that night, on the 9th of November 1989, when huge crowds gathered by the Berlin Wall. Their sheer numbers forced open the checkpoints to the west. Within hours, tens of thousands amassed at the Berlin Wall. This, the ultimate symbol of repression, was then pulled apart with hammers, ropes, and pickaxes. Families forced apart by the wall were reunited after decades. If ever anyone doubted that the hunger for freedom is inextinguishable, they only had to watch the TV during that period.
Я думаю, что идеально было сделано.
I think it all went fantastically. It was an issue fraught with the most extreme danger, but we achieved a solution without bloodshed. But not everyone was happy with the direction we were moving. Only 18 months later, my leadership and my life would be in danger. My enemies waited until I was on holiday in the Black Sea. It all started on a quiet afternoon in August 1991.
Заходит начальник.
I was in my study working, and in came the head of security and announced that some people had
Я
arrived.
никого не звал, и я никого не жду.
I said, I didn't invite anyone. Who let them
Кто их
in?
пустил? Плеханов. И ты, говорю, да.
And this was when I felt something was
Хорошо.
cooking.
Я сразу почувствовал, что-то.
All the phones were dead.
Связь выключена полностью. Городскую,
Even the nuclear hotline was dead.
внутренний, и он молчит. Все было
I was completely cut off.
сразу. Я пригласил,
I went to the veranda and said to Raisa,
читала газеты.
I think something's about to happen,
Все может быть.
and I don't know what the outcome will be.
Может иметь самый плохой конец.
She was shaken by the news, but remained cool. My visitors wanted to seize power. They'd invented a story that I was sick.
Полномочий вице-президенту на период моего якобы больнее.
They tried to make me sign a decree handing over power to the vice president in connection with my illness, my alleged illness.
Естественно, я
One suggested I resign.
сказал, что думал.
I told them exactly what I thought of them.
А в конце просто
I called them jerks, among other things. Guards with machine guns took up position. We were cut off from the outside world.
Последующие 72 часа были самые тяжелые в моей жизни.
Михаил Сергеевич Горбачев
Mikhail Gorbachev
находится сейчас на отдыхе и лечении в Крыму.
is now on vacation. He's undergoing treatment in the south of our country. He
Какое-то время для того, чтобы
is
поправил свое здоровье.
very tired after these many years, and he will need some time to get better.
Raisa and I knew that if I was killed, there would be no record of my murder. So we secretly recorded an address to the people. The people had to know what had really happened.
Все то, что сказано товарищем Генаевым и обнародовано в документах этого комитета, все это грубая ложь, подлог. Совершено, по сути дела, государственное преступление.
Наша задача была, или если удастся, то сейчас эту пленку,
We were hoping that either we could pass the tape on to someone,
способы.
or otherwise we could hide it in the hope that it would be found. In Moscow, the hardliners sent in the tanks. They thought everyone would fall into line, as in the past. But the people were having none of it. Thousands came out onto the streets and surrounded the Russian parliament, preventing its capture by the coup plotters. These brave people had tasted freedom for the first time. Now they weren't about to have it stolen from them. They became a symbol of defiance. The people faced down the army. They made it clear they'd rather die than go back to the old ways. And finally, the tanks withdrew. The coup had collapsed. The hardliners failed to realize that my reforms had changed Soviet society forever. The people had won. But then things took a turn I hadn't expected. The coup had been mounted in the name of communism and the Communist Party. And now the people, in their rage, refused to draw distinctions. For them, all communists were implicated. And they were determined that the old Stalinist regime could never rise again. Their solution was simple: eradicate communism altogether. Every communist, both hardline and reformer, was now a target as hysteria swept the country. I had thought the party could adapt, but now it was abolished. Its buildings and its property seized. And the assault didn't stop there. As politicians maneuvered, a series of new laws were passed. One even abolished the Soviet Union itself. Overnight, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. And though this was the least of it, my job as its leader, I was forced to resign my post of president. The decades since I left office have been tough for the Russian people. My country went from communism to a form of capitalism within a few short years. Economic chaos followed. Unemployment rose sharply. Living standards collapsed. And there was civil disturbance. And even civil war. It was tough for me too. I had to watch it all from the sidelines, unable to help my country. And I had my own share of personal tragedy. Shortly afterwards, Raisa, who meant so much to me, died of leukemia. She was only 67. If I hadn't become president, she'd still be alive. It was all the stress of the things we went through during the years of perestroika and afterwards that took their toll and meant she went before her time. It's such a loss which our family has suffered. In our optimistic days in the 1950s, when we met at university, Raisa and I talked about how we might help our country and mankind. It's that which drives me forward now. I've started a foundation which brings people together with different opinions and political persuasions. It's based on the idea that while everyone has strongly held principles, we can change our opinion about the best way to achieve these. That's, after all, what I did in my career. I moved away from the dream of communism to more realistic beliefs. I now believe the founders of the Soviet Union tried to impose a communist system which ran counter to human nature. They tried to prevent enterprise and trade which have always existed. Marxist supporters, though not Marx, did a lot of wrong. They tried to suppress what drove normal society. Now the West is trying to do much the same. Capitalism seeks to suppress equally important values such as solidarity and equality. This too creates a society which runs counter to human nature. If there's one lesson from history, it is that we should never try to suppress universal human values. And it is capitalism which now requires its own perestroika. Our experiment in Russia, with the dream set out in the Communist Manifesto, ended as swiftly as it had begun. It brought joy and liberation, but there was a terrible price to pay. For the founders of communism failed to realize the dream is never achievable. If it's achievable, it's not a dream.
And Jermaine Greer discusses feminism in Big Ideas That Change the World next Tuesday night at the same time, 7:15. Coming up next on 5, the most enigmatic of ancient monuments, the Sphinx, gives up its secrets in just a moment.